With Robert Eggers' widely anticipated remake of Nosferatu drawing ever closer, film lovers have been visiting and revisiting the 1922 and 1979 versions of the Gothic masterpiece. My abnormal brain, however, wants me to suffer, and is beckoned towards that other strange little movie that sullied the Nosferatu name. Nosferatu in Venice, also known as Vampire in Venice, was released in 1988 and was intended to be a sequel to the Herzog iteration. Besides Klaus Kinski returning as the titular monster, a brief dialogue exchange concerning past events during a plague, and an attempt to recreate that earlier film's impeccably gloomy atmosphere, there was little in common. Still, Nosferatu in Venice had real potential to be a fine addition to the classic villain's legacy. But because it's a Kinski movie, a late 80s Kinski movie at that, of course the entire production and resulting movie were absolutely decimated by insane behind-the-scenes drama. You're gonna want to stay tuned for that nonsense. The film's storyline is okay, but is ripe with thematic potential. It is set in Venice, unsurprisingly, and follows Christopher Plummer's hero, a Van Helsing-esque professor who travels to the Italian city. A princess named Henrietta contacted the vampire expert, as she believes Nosferatu is trapped in a coffin beneath her family home, which has historical links to the evil fiend. They venture into the Venetian catacombs below, and there is indeed something there. But is it the vampire he seeks? The sad professor, who himself is facing the end of his days from an unspecified illness, has a theory about old Nosy. He concludes that Nosferatu is terminally depressed after 1,000 years of this endless, despairing existence. It's not just projection on his part. Their seance awakens Nosferatu from a 200-year slumber, and he instantly proves the professor right. Long sleeps, monotone statements like, "Time has no meaning in a life that never ends," aimless wandering, only showing any sign of energy when it comes to either food or boobs. Basically, he's a moody teenager who just discovered Nietzsche. Bad news for the group though, the seance did raise him, but not in their crypt, which would have been under their control. Nah, turns out that coffin was inhabited by Han Solo leaving his carbonite display case. On the loose, Nosferatu is free to continue his devilish will, slowly making his way back to the woman who summoned him. As Plummer also decreed, the only thing that can truly stop the vampire is not sunlight, not crucifixes, not even a shotgun, which would just turn him into the T-1000. No, Nosferatu's end can only come from true, unconditional love from a virgin, so that's where he's headed. I adore the concept of a depressed Nosferatu who is actively seeking death, especially Kinski's version, who was always a miserable little shit. And Venice is the perfect location for such a tale. All that beautiful architecture and history, enhanced by fog machines, really does feel like part of Herzog's established setting. It's not a Nosferatu film without a really cool shadow scene. You know, there are a handful of positives here. Donald Pleasance is also here, as a fearful priest. Both he and Plummer are professional as ever, despite the film that's going on around them, bless them. Barbara De Rossi does a decent job filling shoes moulded by Isabella Adjani. Well, at least until the film decides she's not really that important, so she vanishes for long stretches of time. There's a fun flashback, where the vampire uses wind power to blow his enemies out a window down onto some spiky spikes. And without giving away the ending, there's a really fantastic, ironic twist on the standard angry mob finale that is perfect for the tragedy of Nosferatu's character. Sadly, these positives are overshadowed by the negatives. Overshadowed. The engrossing and competent first act suddenly shifts. Any and all momentum in the plot is lost, with repetition kicking in. As stated before, characters just come and go through the narrative, disappearing for entire acts. Even the good stuff like the fence kill is lessened, because when Nosferatu decides to kill again, he goes for the exact same method. Man, he really is depressed and lazy. My favourite example of nonsensical editing is as follows. we sit for a long and very serious discussion between the protagonists, before we unexpectedly cut to Kinski getting incredibly angry at a load of dogs. And we just as quickly cut away from that to a very long second unit travelogue montage. Woohoo! And it is these types of montages that really dissolve the film down into a sloppy mess with no sense of focus. I lost count of all the times we are subjected to either unnecessary shots of locations that bear no relevance to the coming scenes, or long sequences of people dancing, or Nosferatu simply wandering around like a bored old geezer on vacation. And I would walk 500 miles, and I would walk 500 more, just to be the vamp that walked oceans of time to fall down at your door. To summarize the problems, it all just becomes a big vague mess. However, when you learn about what was happening behind the camera, it's a miracle that there's any movie to watch at all. The production was cursed from the start. Producer Augusto Caminito was openly seeking horror scripts that he could easily produce and sell to international markets. How blessed he must have felt when a sequel script to a known property landed in his lap, with the original star already involved in talks. Klaus Kinski seemingly only signed up for the film in order to negotiate the production of his own long-gestating passion project, Paganini, a biography of the renowned violinist. That should have been red flag number 1. Maurizio Lucidi was initially hired as director and started shooting footage at Venice Carnival. The cast wasn't present, but it would add natural production value and provided a good sense of the city and its historical vibe. He never would get the chance to work with any of the esteemed actors involved, as the producer had a change of heart. Caminito believed the project could be a big hit, so he plotted to nab a more well-known director instead, and planned to funnel in a much larger budget. Maurizio was fired, but not before being paid his full salary. His replacement was Pasquale Squitieri, who brought his own vision for the movie. He amended the script so that it was now set in the future, for one thing. Kinski wasn't too fond with this, so the pair butted heads. Caminito quickly found himself with an ultimatum: either lose the director or lose the star. Seeing as Klaus Kinski was their meal ticket, and because Pasquale's ideas were becoming too costly, the director was fired without shooting any footage, but not before also being paid his full salary too. Third time's the charm, wondered Caminito. Mario Caeno was the third director hired to helm the project, which was now back to being a more modest, lower-budget affair. Amazingly, Mario actually managed to begin shooting the film. To be specific, he managed to film for one single day. Kinski's unhinged reputation came into full swing from shot 1, as he suddenly refused to apply the iconic makeup and demanded to keep his luscious locks. Weirdly, he does look naturally monstrous enough that it still works, but it caused obvious disruptions and tension. Mario and Klaus got into heated arguments regarding the direction of the film, with the actor claiming he had been promised directorial duties. A dry run for his Paganini project, if you will. Petty as ever, Kinski performed his well-known trick of refusing to stop once his director had called cut. Seeing the writing on the wall, and given the issues Kinski had recently caused on Crawl Space and Cobra Verde, the director abandoned ship. With the entire production hemorrhaging money, and with the whole cast and crew waiting about, Caminito himself reluctantly took over as the fourth director, despite having very little experience. Klaus Kinski was placated somewhat. He was given directorial control over some scenes. According to the crew, he ended up with about 10 hours of footage, which was entirely composed of him just walking around alone. Well, that explains all those scenes. To give Kinski some credit, in combination with the synth soundtrack, his solemn wandering about does benefit the theme of an eternal, undying, depressed vampire. But in the context of the onset drama, that this is all the great ego of Kinski could muster, it is rather amusing. Caminito was practically winging it, and in the circumstances, I think he did an alright job, especially because Kinski was determined to sabotage the production at every single step. He consistently ignored storyboards and rehearsals, meaning entire camera and lighting setups had to be reconfigured at great expense and time. Once they finally did get rolling, the actor would continue to disregard any semblance of a plan, do his own thing instead, and then refused to do a second take. Knowing that he had the production by the balls, he felt emboldened to get actresses fired and hired at will. Now that he was surrounded by the women he wanted, his actions towards the actresses took things to another despicable level. Barbara de Rossi spoke at length at how terrified she and the other female cast were. Kinski would disregard direction and script as usual, but during more intimate scenes, this behaviour took on a more criminal nature. De Rossi claims he would improvise, getting very physically rough to the point of pain, and would grab at her breasts. Other crew members detailed how a bit part actress was abused by the cretin. The scene should have been simple. Nosferatu leans over the woman and bites her neck. Typical vampire stuff. Kinski instead allegedly forced her down, jammed his fingers inside her, and even bit her down there. She abandoned the set in tears, humiliated and violated. Eventually, the crew decided enough was enough and refused to continue production with this man, until Kinski later apologised. Doesn't quite seem like a fitting punishment for such heinous behaviour, but there we are. After running out of budget and time, the crew left Venice with only half the script covered. Caminito shot some scenes in a cheaper location, but ultimately had to call it quits. The script was never entirely filmed, and the producer scrabbled a movie together as best as he could. With all that in mind, the finished product makes infinitely more sense. All the awkward edits, confused plotting, and that endless meandering second unit footage padding out the runtime. I have to lament the whole situation, because I can see the initial promise behind the project, before all the drama blew it out the window, impaling it on a spike. Nosferatu in Venice became a notorious flop in every regard. I would say we could take solace knowing that Kinski's reign of terror was short-lived after this, but the truth is, after all the villainy, the controversial man still concluded his career on his terms, helming his dream project as star, writer, and director. Life's a bitch. Let's all awkwardly leap off a very small bridge to our doom!